In this video, we're actually going to cover the row data gateway pattern and the active record pattern because they're both very similar data source persistence patterns. And first off, we're going to cover the row data gateway pattern and then move into the active record pattern because the active record pattern is basically just an extension of the row data gateway pattern. So first things first, let's cover the row data gateway pattern. And what is a row data gateway? Well, it's basically just an object that mimics a row in the database, so it has properties that mirror the columns of a database table. It contains no business logic, and it has functions that manipulate its place in the database, such as insert, update, or delete. So before I get into the pros and cons of a row data gateway, let's actually create one so I can show you guys what it's all about firsthand. So let's go ahead into our blank project here, and we're going to just create a new folder called gateways. And inside here we're going to have our row data gateway, and it's just going to be a class, and we're going to call it the media gateway. And the reason it's a media gateway is because our domain that we're working with is a library. So we have two tables here. And we have a media table that has all of these different types of media. So we have a biography, which is a book. A book is type 0. Sports Illustrated, which is a magazine. Magazine is type 1. And a movie, Napoleon Dynamite, which is type 2 for movie. And then you can also check out these medias, and they each have a due date associated with them. And I don't think we're going to be doing much with the checkout table in this video, so we can close that out and just focus on the media table. So we have this empty class. Let's make this public. And to start things off, we're just going to throw some properties on this media gateway because, as we recall, a row data gateway has properties that reflect each column in the table that the gateway is made for. So we're going to have a column, or we're going to have a property for ID, name, and type. So let's do that. It'll just be a simple property. And then we need one for name. That'll be a string. And then we need one for media type, which is going to be an enum that we haven't quite created. We can just create that up here. Media type. And we have book, magazine, and movie. Okay, so that is the basics of the row data gateway. But of course, a row data gateway also has that database manipulation logic on it, and that's going to be 3 more functions. So we're going to have a public void insert, and then we're going to have a public void update, and then we're going to have a public, we'll make this one a bool for like true or false. It's going to be delete. So if the delete was successful, it'll return true. If it was false, it'll return, or if the delete was unsuccessful, it'll return false. So now we just need to fill out these 3 functions, and we're going to be doing some SQL. So first thing we need to do is create a SQL connection. And this is pretty similar to the other videos I've done with gateways. So same thing, we're going to need a connection string. And to get that connection string, let's make sure you import SQL connection. You're going to have to install the NuGet package for, what is it, system.data.sql client. But we're going to have to get this connection string, and that is going to be through the constructor. So we're going to have a read-only field for the connection string. And then we're going to need a constructor to get that connection string. Let's move that down here. And then now that we have this SQL connection, we're going to have to open the connection, which is something that I always forget to do, because you'd think it would just open it for you after the using statement, but it doesn't. And then we're going to have to create a SQL command, and we'll just call this command. And we can use our connection to create a command that will run against our connection string. And now we have our command. We need to set the command text, which is just the SQL, and this is an insert, so we're going to do an insert into media. We're going to do the name and the type columns. We're not doing the ID column because that's going to be automatically generated for us. And then the values that we're going to insert, they're going to be a couple of parameters. And parameters you prefix with this @ symbol. And we're going to name these parameters name and type. Okay, and now we just need to set those parameters. Add with value. So the parameter name, we named it name, and then the value is just going to be this property that we have on our media gateway. And then we can do the same thing for type, and that is just going to equal our type that we have up here, but I think we need to cast it to an int because that is how we store it in the database. I don't know if it'll do that cast automatically for us, but we're just going to do it manually. And now what we need to do after an insert is we need to get the ID of what we inserted, the generated ID. So that's going to go on our ID property, and what we can do for that is we can execute our command as a scalar. So if we look at execute scalar, what it does is it executes the query and returns the first column of the first row in the results set. So if we think about the first column of the first row, that's going to be our ID column, as you can see right here. Say this was like a table that we got back from a query, then the first column would be ID and the first row would be the new record. So that works for our use case, and we don't have to query the database for the new ID. That would be extremely inefficient. And this returns an object because I assume the first column in the first row could really be anything, but we know it's going to be an int, so we could just cast it to an int. And what we're going to do actually is I'm just going to copy all of this into here because the setup is kind of the same, and really all we're changing when we update is our SQL. So let's replace this with an update statement, and we're going to do update media set. We're going to set a few things here. So we're going to set the name equal to a name parameter, and we're going to set the type equal to a type parameter, and we're going to do this where the ID equals the ID of the current object that we're dealing with. So let's fill in these parameters. So name is going to equal name, type is going to equal type. Let's keep these in order. ID is going to equal the ID of this object. And then we're not going to do a scalar anymore. I think we can just do command.execute. I think a non-query. We don't really need anything back from this. We just want to execute it and everything will be okay. If it doesn't work, it'll throw an exception. We can deal with that. And then last but not least, we have a delete. So let's go ahead and copy all this again. And all that changes is our SQL. So delete from media where ID equals the ID of this object. We can get rid of these parameters, and then we're going to execute a non-query, and what this does is it returns the number of rows affected. So if more than 0 rows are affected, then that means that we deleted something and our delete was successful. If 0 rows were affected, that means our delete was not successful, and we can return false. So now this is great. We have our deletes, we have our updates, we have our inserts, but you might be thinking, how do we even get a media gateway? We're going to need some kind of find operation or a get operation to read stuff from the database. And you might be thinking, oh, let's just create a public void find, and then inside this method we can read from the database and then fill in all these properties. But that's actually kind of silly, because then you'd have to create or construct a media gateway, and then you'd have to run this find method to fill in all these properties, and it's kind of like you're doing a two-step process to create a media gateway. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to create a new type of object that's going to do that two-step process for us, and we're going to call these finders. And we're going to create a new item call it a media finder. And it's going to be a public class. And it's going to need our connection string, of course. So let's add that as a field. And we're going to have to pass that through the constructor. So this class is going to have one function. And it's going to create a media gateway for us by reading a record from the database that has the ID that gets passed into the function. So it's just a find by ID from the database, and it puts all the data that it gets into the media gateway. So we're going to have to connect to our database, so we're just going to copy all of this again. And what we're going to do is we're going to have to change this command text. So basically, connect to the database, run this command, and the command is going to be select star, so select all columns from the media table where the ID equals the ID parameter, which is going to be this. Let's go ahead and add that parameter. And reading data from the database is a little bit funky, so what we have to do is create a data table that is going to store the result from the query. To import that. And then we're going to have to create a SQL data adapter. SQL data adapter, and it takes in this command right here that we created. And then what we can do is we can do adapter.fill table. So what it does is this adapter will run this command and fill this data table with the result of the command. So with that filled, what we can do is we can get the row from this data table, and we'll call this raw media, and we're just going to get the first row because we're assuming that this data table has one row in it, and that is the row with the ID that we desire. Of course, say you put in an ID that doesn't exist, then this will return like null or something or throw an exception. So of course this is just a demonstration, so we're not going to be checking for that. But if you're doing anything with production, make sure that your data table actually has some rows in it before you do this. So now we have our row, and all we have to do is map that row into a new media gateway. And our media gateway is going to need to take a connection string, which we just have up here. And then let's create some, or let's fill in these properties. So the ID is going to equal just this ID that gets passed into the function, because we know that that ID matches the ID in the database table, or in the database row. And then the name is going to equal the raw media. So we're going to go into the row, and then we're going to get a, not get field, I think it's just field. And that field is a string. And then we just say the name of the column. So if we look at our media table, we're getting the name column. So we can just say name. And then we can copy that, and we need to fill in the type. And that field is going to be a media type, which is this enum that we created up here. And the column with that data is named type. So that'll return this media gateway that has the data in the database. Okay, so we're back in the program.cs, and we're ready to test this out. So what we're going to do is let's create a media finder. Make sure you import that. We'll call it finder equals new media finder, and it takes a connection string, which I should have handy. No, that's not the connection string. Just grab it over here. There we go. And we can pass that in, and then we can use our finder to get a media gateway. So let's do that. Make sure you import media gateway. We'll call this media, and we'll use our finder.find, and the ID we're going to use is just 1. And then what we can do is we can change some stuff on this media, so we can set the name to Singleton Sean Biography. and then we can call media.update. And if we look at our media table, we have ID1, the current name is biography, but we're going to update it to Singleton Sean biography. Okay, so we can actually just, let's get rid of that. And let's just actually run this. Well, let me put a breakpoint there. Okay. And we'll take a look at the media that comes back. So there we go, we have our media, and it has the ID, name, it's a book. So if we finish up running, we can refresh our table, and there we go, Singleton Sean biography. Now another thing that we want to test is, let's go ahead and insert a new media. So I'm actually just going to comment that out. So let's create a new media gateway, and we're going to create just a blank media gateway, and it's going to take our connection string, not that, like that, and let's actually define some stuff on here. So let's give it a name of Jumanji, which is a great movie, and then the type is going to be media type dot movie. And then all we have to do is say media.insert, and it'll put this object in the database. And the reason we're not doing an ID is because our IDs are automatically generated in this table. So let's go ahead and just run this. And we get an exception. Okay. So cannot insert the value null into the column ID. And maybe our database table doesn't automatically generate IDs. Let's go ahead into View Designer for the media table, and no, it actually doesn't. So let's go into Properties, and we can select this column, and yeah, identity specification, that needs to be true, and we can save, or we can just update right here. And now our table should automatically generate an ID. So we can X out of that, and let's go back to our program. Let's try running this again. And now we execute Scalar, and I don't think it returns maybe it doesn't return the first column. Oh, I think what we need to do, I've seen this before. So yeah, if we look at execute scalar, it returns the first column of the first row in the result set, but if we're running an insert command, then we're not actually going to get a result set back. So it's just going to return like an empty data table. It's not like a select command where you get a result set. So what we can do is we can say after this insert, output inserted dot ID, and it'll give us the ID of whatever we insert, and that'll just be in one little data table that has like one row and one column, and that'll be returned from our execute scalar. So now if we run this, let's actually look at our table. So it did create that. Let's delete it so we can start fresh, and let's run this, and everything was good. We get some kind of debugging thing there that I should probably check out, but anyways, let's refresh this, and there we go, it created our new movie. And that pretty much sums up the row data gateway pattern, and let's talk about it a little bit. So a lot of people look at this pattern and they don't like how all of this database code is stuck on this media gateway object, because say you wanted to maybe not use a database, you want to use a file, or you want to test the media gateway, well, you're going to have to deal with all this database stuff that's stuck in here, and it's actually not that big of a deal. So what you can do actually is just extract an interface from this, and then you could say you wanted to have a gateway that was like file media gateway. Then you could implement the interface, blah blah blah, and then in your inserts, updates, and deletes, you could just do all your file stuff, and If the caller is just depending on this interface, then it doesn't need to know if you're using a database or a file. And then say if you're testing, you create another one that is just like a mock media gateway. And then same thing, you can implement this interface, and then your inserts, updates, and deletes, they can just do something to an in-memory object to simulate updates, inserts, and deletes. So I don't think that's a big deal with the row data gateway pattern actually, if it's handled correctly by depending on interfaces. So we've been talking about the row data gateway pattern this entire time, haven't even started talking about the active record pattern, so let's get into active records. So the only difference between a row data gateway and an active record is that a row data gateway has no business logic, but an active record does have business logic. So to demonstrate an active record, all I have to do is add some business logic to this row data gateway that we have right here. And to do that, I'm just going to use the same business logic that we've been using throughout this series. So a book can be checked out for 28 days, a magazine for 14 days, and a movie 7 days. So I'm going to create a property, and it's going to return an int, and we're going to call it max checkout days, and it's going to be a get, and all we're going to do is have a little switch statement, and we're going to switch on the type. So, oh, it automatically filled that in for me. That's very nice. Okay, so if it's a book, then we're going to return 28. If it's a magazine, we're going to return 14. And if it's a movie, we'll return 7. And then by default, we'll just return 28. And there we go. We have an active record because we just have business logic on here along with our database manipulation functions. But now that creates a little bit of an issue. So let's look at our interface. Let's go to that definition. So now it's going to have an int max checkout days, and it's going to be a getter. So that's going to be on our interface now. So that means all of these gateways that we created, so the file media gateway, they're going to have to implement that interface, and then they're going to have to implement this business logic that we have right here. That's going to have to be implemented across all of our gateways. So then we're going to be duplicating business logic. So there's a couple ways that you could get around that. So you could turn this iMedia gateway, you could turn this into an abstract class maybe, and then implement the business logic right here. Or what you could do is you could just have one media gateway instead of having a file media gateway or a mock media gateway. You could just have one that has the business logic, and then what it could do is it could take in some kind of strategy that will handle inserting updates and deletes into the database. So that's more of like a composition approach, and we're not going to get into that, but it's just something to look out for if you're going to be using active records or row data gateways. So overall, that's the row data gateway pattern and the active record pattern. Again, a row data gateway is just an object that mimics a row in the database, has properties that reflect the columns of a table in the database, and then also has database manipulation functions. And then an active record is just a row data gateway that has business logic as well. Anyways, if you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave them in the comments. Other than that, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.